We respect Reagan's 11th commandment.
I hope we continue that for the next 2 months.
Absolutely.
Okay, I'm Jim Greenfield. I'm running for the seat in the 1st District in the special election to replace David Wu. I ran against David Wu in 2002. This time there's no incumbent, so I think a Republican has a good shot at it. And I don't need to persuade you folks of anything, because I think you all understand the issues, but I would like to start by asking you a question. Suppose you had a friend who came to you and asked for advice, and he said, you know, I make a pretty good living, $100,000 a year, but I spend $140,000 a year, and I'm hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt. What's your advice? What should I do? Is there anybody who would say, my advice is that you should borrow more money and spend more? No. You don't need a PhD in economics to understand this. You'd say, you've got a spending problem, you need to cut your spending. And yet the political establishment in Washington, mostly the Democrats, but some Republicans also, say that the solution to America's problems is that we should borrow more money and keep spending to stimulate the economy. And they expect us to buy this. Now, you know, I'm sure you all remember a month or two ago, it was all over the news, the crisis about the debt limit, about increasing the debt limit. And we kept hearing that the crisis was that there were people in Congress, mostly Tea Party Republicans, this was a crisis that they didn't want to increase the debt limit. That was the crisis. Is there anybody here who thinks that that was the real crisis? The crisis wasn't raising the debt ceiling. The crisis was the debt. Almost $15 trillion plus another $60 trillion in unfunded liabilities. So, what we need to solve this problem is people in Congress who understand this, who understand that you can't solve a spending problem by borrowing more money or by taxing more. You need to solve the spending problem by cutting spending. Now, you know, a lot of people have been talking, this has come into vogue in the last couple of years to start talking about a balanced budget and living within the limits of the Constitution. But I want you to all understand, I didn't just start talking this way a year or two ago. I have something, in case anybody wants me to prove it, you can read this afterwards, something copyrighted 1990 by Jim Greenfield, in which I called at that time for restoring constitutional limits, restoring our government to constitutional limits, balancing the budget, abolishing the income tax, and letting the free market create prosperity and wealth for Americans. So I guess you could say I was Tea Party before anybody had heard of Tea Party except for the one in Boston. Now, I don't have much time, so I want to finish with a quote. Oh, that's right, I put it in my pocket. And I want you all to guess who said this. I'll give you a hint. It wasn't Barack Obama. I am for a government vigorously frugal and simple. To preserve the people's independence, we must not let our rulers load us with perpetual debt. For this is the tendency of all human governments, till the bulk of society is reduced to be mere automatons of misery. Then it begins indeed the war of all against all. And the forehorse of this frightful team is public debt. Taxation follows that, and in its train, wretchedness and oppression. We must not let our rulers load us with perpetual debt. And somebody said who it was who wrote this. That's right. The author of the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson, a little bit ahead of his time. He foresaw this kind of crisis coming. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Oh, yeah, I do want to point out that if anybody wants to support my campaign, I don't have time to go into more detail, but if, you know, people want to know how I want to cut spending, that gets into a lot of detail, but I'm not afraid to say, you know, a lot of politicians, if you say, you know, if they're asked, well, what programs would you cut, they change the topic. But I'm not going to do that. I have very specific ideas of where we should be cutting spending, and I would start by saying, well, what does the Constitution say? If it's not authorized in the Constitution, maybe we should start phasing it out, which would be about 2/3 of the domestic spending of the U.S. government. And I just want to point out that Richard Burke back here has 3x5 cards. If anybody wants, to help the campaign in any way, financially or with help, you could take one and give us your contact information. Yeah, go ahead.
When you say you want to get rid of the income tax, are you proposing to replace it with something else, or get rid of that income to the government in general, combined with massive spending cuts?
Well, I think we would have to, this is something that would have to be phased in over time, that we would have to be cutting spending, first get to balance, and then I would say, let's start getting surpluses to pay off the past debt, okay? But in the meantime, I think the income tax is a very inefficient way to collect taxes, and it's counterproductive because it destroys incentives and therefore destroys wealth. So I would support something like either the fair tax concept, some kind of a national sales tax to replace the income tax. Now, we got to repeal the 16th Amendment to do this, so they can't bring it back, or a flat tax, something along those lines. Okay, yeah.
What are your thoughts on the general welfare part of the Taxation Clause and the Commerce Clause?
Sorry, could you repeat that?
What are your thoughts on the general welfare part of the Taxation Clause of the United States Constitution and the Commerce Clause of the United States Constitution?
Okay, I always carry my Constitution with me just in case of emergencies like this. The welfare portion, and I should mention, I went to law school, I did practice law for a while, and I have studied constitutional law, and I feel that I understand it pretty well, the basics at least. The welfare portion of the Taxation Clause is modifying the right to tax. It's unfortunate, they didn't make many mistakes, but they did make a couple, and that was one of them, putting that there because it creates a kind of an ambiguity. But the Supreme Court has held that that clause does not create a new power to promote the general welfare. It's just explaining why Congress has the power to tax. It's for the purpose of promoting the general welfare. And by the way, when the Founding Fathers used the phrase promote the general welfare, they didn't mean handing out money to people who didn't work. They meant it promote the welfare of all of us, collectively. Okay? And the Commerce Clause has been one of the most misunderstood clauses of the Constitution. It was unfortunate, I think it was an 1824 case, the Supreme Court said that it should be broadly construed, but they were doing that for the purpose of preventing states from interfering with interstate commerce. They weren't trying to create an unlimited power for the federal government to regulate everything that all of us do. And unfortunately, that's the way some subsequent courts and a lot of liberals, progressives, whatever you want to call them, have interpreted that Commerce Clause as if it gives the federal government unlimited power. It doesn't. This is a government of limited powers that are delegated in the Constitution, and they don't have the right to seize power and try to, justify it by some obscure clause of the Constitution.
Okay, let's give Jim a hand. Thank you.